County Public Schools. We welcome you all to tonight's workshop. Tonight's workshop will focus on understanding the components of your child's IEP or 504 plan. As we go throughout tonight, we ask that you please feel free to give us any questions that you have regarding the components of your child's IEP or 504 or the process. You may be able to give us questions through YouTube or our Zoom link through the chat features. We will not be able to answer any question if it's individual experiences. If you have any questions regarding your child's individual experience at their school, we encourage you to please reach out to your child's EC teacher, 504 coordinator, or the school's administrative team. At this time, we will turn this workshop session over to our Executive Director of EC Services and Student Services, Mrs. Christy Grant, our lead program specialist, Martha Stroud, and our whole child coordinator, Mrs. Tequila Jones.
Good evening, and we are excited that you are joining us for us to help you better understand your child's individualized education program or 504 plan. We're going to walk through the components of each plan, and hopefully you can grab your child's 504 plan or IEP plan now to kind of walk through that with us as we're going through step by step. So the first thing we wanted to kind of do is talk about the difference in the 504 plan versus the individual education plans. And I'm going to let Ms. Jones talk about the 504.
Good evening. As Ms. Grant said, I'll start off with the 504 plan. And so one of the differences or significant differences between a 504 and an IEP is that a 504 focuses on any physical or mental impairments that might limit any type of substantial major life activity. And so, for example, learning, reading, being able to care for oneself are just some of the examples of some of the things we look at for life activities. And then 504 plans are intended to provide equal access to education. And so it does not provide specially designed instruction. We focus on providing support so that child has equal access to the education as their peers. And then there is no state or federal funding that's specific to 504.
And in terms of the IEP process, students are found eligible to meet one of the criteria for either one or more, actually, of the 14 disabling conditions that do require specially designed instruction. So whereas 504 is just what does that child need in order to level the playing field, to have equal access to their education, our IEPs and a student found eligible with an IEP would be somebody who would need a little bit more than just the accommodations provided to access their education. They'll need specially designed instruction based on the specific needs of those students. And we do have state and federal funding that's provided for students with an individualized education plan. And what you see in the middle is both. So a child with a 504 plan and an IEP could both be found eligible to receive accommodations, modifications, related services, and we're going to go through all of these as we walk through the components of the plan that are needed in order to provide access to the education for students with the eligible disabling conditions, regardless of which plan they have. Okay, so we are first going to go through what are the parts of an individualized education plan, also known as your child's IEP. So if you will pull up that for me. Okay, so the first thing that you will see that I want to draw your attention to is the number one little star there, or image, when IEPs must be in effect. So of course an IEP team can come back and meet at any point in time when the child needs to, but at least annually the team needs to come together and determine whether the annual goals for the child are being achieved, revise the IEP as appropriate, address any progress or lack of progress, and redetermine what the child's needs are, or where the child has progressed and no longer needs the services or supports in place. So, but remember, even though that date is an annual date that occurs, the team could come back and meet anytime. So you as a parent could request a meeting if you have concerns about your child and about the plan that's in place for them. If you move down to the number 2 bullet, we start into the student profile. And this is where we first want the team to talk about the student's overall strengths that contribute to the success in the educational environment. We and you as a parent really need to have input here, because we do see the child in our educational setting, but how is the child also at home, and what do you see when you're working with your child at home with homework, how he gets along with others, maybe his siblings or others out in the neighborhood, etc. We also want to know what your concerns are. So the next section that's highlighted is, what are the parent concerns, if you have any, and you may not, about your child's academic and functional performance in school. And then an important piece that kind of helps us start, even with our pre-K kids, what is your vision for the future? What specifically is your vision after your child graduates from high school? What is it that you see that you would like for your child? So that's kind of the first part, which is just the student profile, setting it up so that everybody on the team has a mental picture of the child's strengths and what your concerns and vision are. We then move a little more into what are the specific needs based on data, which is the present level of academic and functional performance. And within this section is basically a statement of where the child is currently functioning. So we look at each area. So what data do we have? And in this example, it also addresses the needs of specially designed instruction, which would be the specific areas. So if you see area address math, there's your data and your relevant information. And is specially designed instruction needed in this area? You could see yes, or you could see no, depending on what the data tells us about your specific child. If you move on down, this is actually the present level that aligns with the math, the area of math, where we're going to look at a strength of the child. What does the child need? What does the data tell us? And how does the child's specific disability or needs affect him or her from performing with grade level content? So we will see that. So there's an example for math. If you move down, you'll see an example for reading. We also have behavior or functional performance, and writing as well. If your child has a related service, or there's a need for speech or language, if you'll scroll on up, you'll see expressive language here. And this is where you would see that yes, your child would need specially designed instruction in order to address some deficits in the area of expressive language. So then we just kind of, and then under that is the actual, here's what the data tells us, here's what the needs are, here's what the strengths are. Then we're going to look at, is there any relevant medical information? And we do like to address that yearly, because the needs of our kids changes from year to year. So we may not have any relevant medical information at this time. And as you see here, it's just, there's no current changes in the medical history. It continues to be seen by the family doctor, the medicine that they have, and he's given medicine at home. So any medical information that you're aware of or that you think is important in helping the team determine the needs. And then how does the child's specific disability impact his or her involvement and progress in the general curriculum? So how does that disability affect whatever the child, what's keeping that child from being able to just be in a regular ed classroom with his non-disabled peers and just excel and move along and grow like everybody else? What is it that they struggle with or that they perform below grade level in? So that will be discussed there. Our next section is called the consideration of special factors. And this is a series of questions that's asked. Is the child an English learner? Does the child receive or have any special communication needs? And so you would have yes and no in the next column. So for this one, you see no to English learner and yes to special needs. If there's a yes there, then underneath that in the additional information, it would be this is how, yes, this child has this, and here is how we're going to address the special needs and factors within the IEP. So then you would want to see that this child is currently receiving speech and language services. So when we get on down into the goals and the service delivery, you'll be able to see that actual service. This particular child does not require any assistive technology devices. They do not require instruction or use Braille, and they do not have a documented hearing loss. For students who are deaf of hard of hearing, however, there is a consideration, and you see the bullet points there. There is also an additional communication plan worksheet that if we were to say yes there, that the student's deaf or hard of hearing, we would complete the communication worksheet for the team to really have those discussions of the documented hearing loss and how the student and the communication language and literacy skills that the student has, and how are those that are necessary to achieve grade level academic skills and concepts in the curriculum. So that's kind of why you see the little 6 there. The next part is for behavior that impedes his or her learning or the learning of others. And if you see a yes there, is the child's behavior needs being met through a behavior intervention plan, behavior goals, or just supplementary aids and supports that are needed in the regular ed classroom. So remember, anytime we see a yes there, we're going to be able to see it somewhere else as we move on down the IEP and as the team talks about the process. The next one is, does the student require adapted physical education? So all students, PE must be available to all students regardless of the child's disability whenever regular ed students receive physical education. So a lot of our students are able just to participate in regular PE with their non-disabled peer and don't need any other additional supports. But we also have children who may need some supplementary aids and modifications in the regular PE classroom, and we have a good many kids that require that. And then we have a handful of kids that, regardless of the supports we put in place in a regular ed physical education classroom, they still need some additional assistance from one of our adapted PE teachers. We do have 2 within our district now. And that child the team has determined based on data that's discussed that the child needs specially designed PE, and there's a goal written in the IEP, and that is how the child is able to receive PE. A new section to the IEP, and some of you, if you've not had an annual review this year so far, you have not seen this part, is the student receiving instruction using extended content standards? And if yes is checked there, that would mean that your child is selected to be assessed using an alternate assessment that is aligned with the alternate achievement standards. We really want you to be informed of your child's achievement, how it will be measured on a different set of standards than the regular education standards, and how participation on those assessments may delay or otherwise affect your student from completing the requirements of a regular high school diploma later on. So our students with an IEP, if they don't graduate with a high school diploma, can stay in school until their 22nd birthday. So that's why when I say delay here, your child may need a little bit longer in order to meet the standards. And then again, it's asking you, because if we do want to know, remember we've already asked you concerns. Are there any additional concerns? Now that we've gone through these special factors, as a parent, let's go back to your concerns and see, is there anything we need to address? So then we move into, after we've addressed the special factors, we move into the secondary transition section. And this section, if your child is not 14, this is only completed for students if they're 14 or older, or they will turn 14 during the life of the IEP. So what this is we are looking at let's start thinking about when your child gets to be 14, what is it that your child wants to do when they graduate from high school? Is it going to a branch of the military? Is it go to a 4-year university or a community college, or is it to get a job? And how can we start looking at the child's strengths, needs, their preferences, their interests, and their course of study to help them carve out a pathway now to meet those needs and their wishes once they graduate from high school. So these are just the following people that participated in the development of the transition plan, and then the course of study, which it could be future ready core, our occupational course of study, or the extended content standards. And then, so that's all we kind of look at. But when the child then becomes 16, we are going to start talking about what are the goals and supports that we now need to put in place. We are going to look at age appropriate transition assessments, which it may just be let's figure out what it is that your child is interested in doing. And a lot of our students at this age don't really know yet what they want to do. So we provide a series of assessments to help them narrow down where their interests are. Based on what those are, then we're going to look at developing some post-secondary goals. And post-secondary means after high school, not during high school, but after high school. What is it that your students wants to do from an educational perspective? What kind of training will they need? What kind of employment or independent living, if that's appropriate? Will they want to live in an apartment by themselves? After we talk about the goals, then we look at then what supports do we need in all the different areas. So as you'll see, the first one is like adult living skills. So what kind of transition activities are there? Who's going to help be responsible for that? And is there an agency? So sometimes we have our students working with vocational rehabilitation to help them transition to a job or either to a university, college or university once they leave us. And there are some things that vocational rehabilitation helps us with, like the functional vocational evaluation. They may say, let's get a little more information for what it is this particular student wants or what they will be good at. And then we would have that there, and then vocational rehabilitation, who we would have in the meeting with your permission, the responsible agency for completing that. Trying to think, was there anything else there that I wanted to mention? Because this is a really important piece when you're talking about helping a child be successful once they leave us from high school. Yes, so if the student is 17 or going to turn 17, during the IEP, life of the IEP, then we need to inform you of the transfer of rights, which is at the very bottom of that page with the TT6, that will happen once your child reaches 18. So when the transfer of right happens, so we're informing you, and then if the student is 18 or older, have you been notified? So we've got two different questions there, because we want to make sure you are aware, and a lot of our parents are not aware, that unless your child has been deemed incompetent under state law, which you would go to the magistrate's office, and there's a process that's worked out. It is not done with the school system, that your child basically at the age of 18 becomes their own adult, and what they wish to happen in an IEP actually occurs. And so we do like our parents and our students to be notified of their rights, because a lot of our parents are not aware of what happens when their child turns 18. So that is it for the transition plan. So remember, if your child is not 14, that whole part will not even be discussed in your meeting. If you think back to the beginning, we talked about the present levels of performance, and we talked about within each of those present levels, there was an identified area for specially designed instruction, and the first area we looked at was math. And so you see the specific area of need here is math. And then within each of those present levels were some needs that were outlined based on the data. Here's what, in this situation, Henry needs to help increase his math skills. So the goals are measurable goals that are written that will help the child progress in their education and help them to master and meet grade level content. So then we have criteria for mastery. So we're going to work on this goal, which is going to be a goal that will last the life of the IEP. So we want them to be able to meet this goal, not in a month after the meeting, but a whole year after that meeting at 80% accuracy. How it's going to be measured. So in this situation, there'll be some informal assessments and some work samples and a work portfolio. They do not need any assistive technology, and it's not related to one of the transition goals that we talked about when we went through the transition plan. Underneath that, the 2 bullets, not every child will have this. Some of your students, those that are on the extended content standards, you'll see what's called short-term objectives. So then you have your annual goal to increase mastery from a mid-second grade level to a beginning 3rd grade level. And here's the 2 ways that Henry's going to do that. Solve 2-step problems, including adding and subtracting, and then compose and decompose numbers with various groupings of hundreds, tens, and ones. So that's just kind of the breakdown. At the bottom of that page, that you'll see underneath each goal is, does the child need any supplementary aids or services to meet these particular goals? We're going to come back and talk about ESY at the end, but just hold on to the thought that here's also where you would identify the goals and are there any supplementary aids and services needed for extended school year. So I'm not going to go through all of these. What I will say is the next one is an example with reading, where you'll see there is a supplementary aid or service there that's listed, which would be the tracker for text. So it could be a highlighted strip where the child reads the passages and follows along with the highlighted strip to keep the child's focus on that particular sentence or section within the curriculum. Within the passage. So we are going to, I just wanted you to make sure that you had the great examples that are on here so that you'll see some examples of a writing, and then we have behavior. And if you remember, the last area we looked at in the present levels was for speech. And these would be the goals how the goals would be written, and you would see the progress noted there. Okay, Ms. Stroud, I believe I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, great. So the next few sections of the IEP from this point to the end, basically the majority of it is going to talk about the services that your child will be receiving and basically show what that looks like. Also going to be talking a whole lot about the accommodations or supports and supplemental aids and services that your child or student might need to reach those goals and to make progress. So in this particular section, we should be on LRE, I think. Yeah. We are going to look at the very top of that. You're going to see where the service area is broken down. This is where we've identified needs previously in the previous portions of the IEP. We've talked about the present levels. We've talked about the goals. And now we're going to identify those areas of need here and talk about what kind of services does that child need to support growth in that area, and where those services going to be provided, and so forth. So if you start with the first column in the chart, that's the service. That just lists the area of need that was identified and the services that are going to be offered to him in specially designed instruction. So the next column, you've got the amount of time. This student, for example, needs reading, and the IEP team determined that he needs 30 minutes of specially designed instruction each week, we're going to talk about the frequency in just a minute, that he's going to get 30 minutes of specially designed instruction. The frequency column shows how often he's going to get that service. In this particular case, they've decided that 5 times a week is appropriate. And then the location of services. That tells where is your child going to receive those services. Is he going to stay in the classroom, or is he going to be removed to the special education classroom? And that would be designated there. So basically here, this section also is determined really by, are they going to be with their non-disabled peers in the classroom, or are they going to be removed to a smaller group? That's the way we explain it a lot of times. The duration really is usually is going to be just the life of this IEP. When did this IEP start and when is it going to end? One thing I didn't say before I even started with the explanation about the services they receive, but least restrictive environment, I just sort of went through that quickly, but that is really a key and critical part of the IEP, and decisions that are made around that are very important. IDA requires that students that do receive specially designed instruction that they are able to remain with their non-disabled peers as much as possible. That's the goal. That's the, what is really the best for the student. We recognize that they have needs and they do need additional support, but as much as possible, we want them to remain in the general ed setting with their peers for as much of the day as they can. So that's really kind of where you need to start, and when the team needs to start when they're looking at making these decisions, just keeping that in mind. Again, like I said, just going back through, you've got your service area, your amount of time, your frequency, your location, and duration. This student gets services, as you can see, in reading, math, writing, and behavior. All students won't get all, services in all those areas. Sometimes it's just reading, sometimes it's just math, etc. We've got some students who only need specially designed instruction to address behavioral needs. So that can look different. The next section is about related services. And what a related services is, once we've identified that the student needs specially designed instruction in one of these core main areas, sometimes students have other needs that impede their learning as well. And really the problem sometimes is that they have other needs that will not, that without support in those areas, they won't be able to make progress toward their IEP goals. For example, a lot of our students receive speech language as a related service. They have expressive language delays or receptive language delays that impact their ability to make progress in reading, math, or writing, or with their behavior goals, for example. Whatever is needed to help to make sure that child can make progress in their other areas of service. We provide related services for. Other areas of related services can be occupational therapy for students who have fine motor skill deficits. You'll see a lot of times that they might need some occupational therapy services. Physical therapy services for students with more gross motor skill deficits may need physical therapy services in the school setting to help them benefit and make progress toward their IEP goals, really. So I'm trying to think if there's any others.
The parent training we have been using in order to help you gain knowledge on how to work with your child at home if there's some specific needs.
Okay. One other related service that is kind of separate down below that chart is transportation. A lot of our students require special transportation and basically to access their educational services. Sometimes that can be in the form of just a bus with a monitor on it, some extra adult support. It can be sometimes special equipment on a bus. If a student's in a wheelchair, it may be a bus that's adapted to transport wheelchairs. So that is another area of related service that we want to make sure we cover in the IEP. So after this, we've decided now what services they need, what those services are going to look like. There's still more to consider. At this point in time in the IEP, you're going to be looking at what supplemental aid services, accommodations, and modifications does this student need to access the general curriculum and to make progress toward his or her IEP goals. Sometimes just the specially designed instruction by itself is not enough, and we need to still kind of layer that support with some additional aid services, modifications, and accommodations. So we'll talk about those in just a second on the next page. So so we'll start up at the top with the classroom activities. Students can receive those extra supplemental aid services and modifications in the classroom on a daily basis if they need it, and they can also receive those for testing. So we're going to kind of talk about those in both places, beginning with classroom. So this student, the way the IEP is going to look is your students, all their daily activities at school are going to be listed. And it's going to be, the team will discuss whether or not that student may or may not need a supplemental aid service, modification, etc., to be successful in that environment. And so a lot of times you'll see like art, assemblies, lunch, career, technical education, computer, especially art, assemblies, lunch, and with elementary kids, we consider it specials. These we sort of refer to as like non-academic or non-instructional times, but students sometimes need supports during those times as well. So we always want to make sure that we address those. And if they don't, you don't put it, nothing would be put there, but if they do, they would be listed out further down in this, part of the IEP. Usually where you're going to see most of your accommodations and supports and things like that that are in, additional, you're going to see in their core areas like their math or their reading. You're going to see when, like, for example, we're going to consider whether or not this student who has significant reading delays and deficits, how is that going to impact him in his science class? Is he going to need some extra support to be able to access that content that's in that textbook and the material that the teachers give out? Does he need read aloud? That's one of the most, I would say probably one of the most frequently used ones is read aloud, because so many of our students do have those reading deficits that prevent them from being able to fully access their instruction. So that would be noted here. Other ones that you're going to see frequently, extended time. Some students need additional time to complete assignments or classroom assessments, things like that. Some students oftentimes will need a smaller setting to complete assignments or to complete classroom assessments. They perform better in a small group. They are easily distracted, and so that helps minimize the impact of that. Some other ones, let's see, that's listed on here. It goes all the way. There's several, ways to provide read aloud. They can get read aloud in all areas except for a class or assignment that addresses reading skills. So that's available to any student who needs it in all those other areas: social studies, science, even in specials if they need it, if text access is a problem. Only time they cannot get it again is in a reading class itself. So I think we went through the most common ones. So if you considering this, the student, gets these things for the classroom. So then we want to talk next about what about for testing? When students, when they get to third grade, they start taking state assessments and things like that. They take district assessments all along, but it becomes very important when they get to these tested grades, especially at third grade, that we consider whether or not these students to be able to access and perform on those tests that all students take, do they need some special accommodations for that? The ones that they're eligible for testing is not, there's not as many. This is a more restricted, area, but there are some that a lot of students need and can get for their testing. Extended time is one that is given quite often. Not as much as it used to be. I think you may have been in IEP meetings now where your EC teacher may explain that, well, it used to be that students, needed extended time because the time that was established for all students was not as much as it is now. I think all students get 4 hours now. So we've sort of backed off of that, but there could still be a situation where it was needed. Read aloud, again, that could be for that's usually done by a computer now, but that can be provided for any assessment except for the reading. Small group is used quite often for testing. It really helps those kids with attention deficit, any kind of test anxiety or whatever to perform if they're not, if they're in a small group. Sometimes students, you may have a student who is tested one-on-one. That could be for extreme, inattentiveness, if they just cannot focus at all with, other students in the room. Or oftentimes students like to read aloud to themselves, and so that would require them to have a one-on-one setting, but that's not as common either. So let's see, read aloud, we've got that. This is for, and I think I jumped before I went to state testing for, I didn't say a lot about district testing, sorry about that, yeah. So district assessments, again, these start before your state assessments, and so it's gonna very much look like what they get for state testing. Mm-hmm. These are their reading benchmarks, their M-class for elementary students, their exact path assessments or admin, all those things that are done routinely throughout the year for all students. So if you have a student with disabilities who has an IEP, they are eligible to receive those accommodations for those tests as well. I did jump in. Okay, so now that we've sort of got that we've talked about the testing and the accommodations that are possible. There's one section, this refers back a little bit back to what Christy was saying earlier when she mentioned about, is your student receiving instruction on alternate achievement standards? So we have to address testing for those students differently as well. And so this part of the IEP is the bold print where it says alternate assessment justification. This would only be completed for students who, for whom we had answered yes to that earlier question. So this is a part of the IEP where we're just required to explain why that student is not able to take the standard assessment. And so here is where it would explain, what your child's deficits are and the significance of them, and how the standardized assessment, for the general curriculum students is not appropriate for them. They can't access that assessment. And this is more aligned with what their curriculum looks like. So that's not going to be filled out unless that applies to your student. The least restrictive environment justification statement goes back to that section that we discussed where we talked about mostly to do with where these services are provided, because again, if you remember, we want to make sure that the students remain with their non-disabled peers as much as possible throughout the day. So, however, there are times when it's appropriate and necessary for students to be instructed in a small group, or to be removed for a 45-minute, instructional or supplemental lesson in reading. This is where we would explain why we need to do that. Why can't these services for this student be provided while he's still in the gen ed classroom? And it can be sometimes, but not always. They've given an example here about why Henry has to be removed from his non-disabled peers. And it usually has to do with what kinds of support. Sometimes students, again, it's when these students require more supports and instruction and a different kind of instruction than what can be provided, as part of the general core curriculum that the teacher will be working on for his in grade level instruction. But so sometimes there will be something there, or if they're not removed, or if they receive their services through a co-teaching model, that section would not be filled out because they stay with their non-disabled peers. The next sections are real quick and pretty basic. Progress reports, we just talk about how often will your student, because they have an IEP, how often will they receive progress reports on how they're progressing toward their goals. So, every reporting period, your child gets a report card. They should also get a progress report, and that is going to be specific to their IEP goals. So when your child brings that report card home, and I guess they went home Monday, they should have gotten a progress report, and that would just be, again, speaking specifically to their IEP goals. So you can be informed as to, how they're progressing toward those. The next section is extended school year status. This is something that causes a little bit of confusion sometimes just because of the name of it, extended school year. A lot of people, parents sometimes think that we're talking about summer school or some of those supplemental programs, but that's really not what this is. Extended school year is a real specialized, highly specialized kind of service, and there's certain real specific criteria that students have to meet in order to qualify. This is for students, for example, who may experience a significant amount of regression after a long break, like summer or even Christmas holidays or Easter vacations, things like that. We have some students who will lose so much, so much ground that they made, or so much progress that they've made if they go home for a long break and are not, have that continuous instruction. So that is what's considered here for extended school year, but it's not the same as summer school. That's one of the main things that's kind of difficult that we have to spend a lot of time explaining. But again, there's very specific instances where that would be appropriate. And then, so basically now you're at the bottom of the IEP, and this is going to be a listing of all the people that attended the meeting. There are required IEP team members that need to be at every meeting. Whenever you're going in for a meeting with your student, you should expect to see their exceptional children's teacher. You should expect to see at least one of their general education teachers. You should expect to see typically an administrator, but we call it the LEA representative, and basically that's somebody at the either district or administrative level that's there in that meeting, who can sort of speak to district resources and policies and things like that. So that person is very important, a key member of the team. So all of those, plus anybody else who has knowledge of your child. Parents often bring people with them that it could be, I don't know, an outside provider that maybe their student is involved with or something like that. So parents can bring additional participants, but as far as what the school system and who's going to be here from the district or your child's school, you should always look for that EC teacher, a general education teacher, an administrator, or other representative from the district to be in there. If they receive related services, you're going to see their speech therapist in there, or their occupational therapist or physical therapist.
I think for the sake of time, because I do want to get to the Section 504 plans as well, the next section, and Martha already talked about this, these are those very specific questions that the team will use and go through as they're talking about eligibility for extended school year. So you can read through those. If you have any questions about this section, you're welcome to submit them. We will get back. I know we've got 2 other sessions we're doing, and we can also talk with your child's teacher or contact one of us. Our emails are on the front sheet. The only other form that we have included in here beside the list of policies that align is just a one-time permission so that to release information for Medicaid billing, and you can read through that. You can give consent or not give consent. So that is all for us. So we are going to turn over now and switch gears to go back to the Section 504 plans.
So my focus is going to look at the actual 504 plan itself, and you will hear the 504 case managers or myself refer to it as the EOP, or the Equal Education Opportunity Plan, and sometimes, most of the time, we just say 504 plan. And so this is what this document looks like. If you have it with you, you can pull it out and kind of follow along, but we're going to break it up into 4 sections and talk about each section. I'm not going to go too deep into eligibility, because I think we'll talk about that in another session, but I do want to help you understand what each parts mean and where that information comes from. So the first thing I want to talk about is if you look at the blue section, that's all student information. And from there, you have the student name, grade, date of birth, age, things like that. One of the things I do want to highlight that's similar to an IEP is that we do review plans annually, and we'll talk about the date. However, just as an IEP, 504 plans can be reviewed anytime. You can request it, staff can request it. When we notice a change with a student or there's some new information, we definitely need to come back to the table and review 504s. So I'm gonna start with the first section, which is student information. And so the first thing we're gonna do is talk about the documented impairment. What is that student diagnosed with, or as far as medical or psychological, but they also can be regarded as having an impairment. So for example, we may have a student that's shown a lot of inattentiveness in class, can't stay in their seat, very unfocused, as compared to their peers. They're like if you say on a scale of 1 to 10, they're worse off than what their peers are with the same behavior. And so then we could say, well, we might have a suspicion that this student is showing signs of having ADHD, right? Or you may give us a diagnosis of ADHD or any other medical or psychological concern. And so we will put that impairment there. A student can have more than one. We'll see students that may have, ADHD along with any other mental health diagnosis, or they can have a physical diagnosis along with a medical diagnosis along with a psychological diagnosis. And so that will go where you see it says documented impairments. Then we start looking at MLA, the major life activity that's substantially limited. And so there is a handout, a worksheet that we use as part of the eligibility process. And we do that at initial eligibility. We can review it anytime that concerns come up. We look at it during our reevals, which are every 3 years. But what we're looking at with major life activities is anything that's affected with your being able to take care of yourself, things like walking, seeing, speaking, breathing, learning, working, communicating, thinking, concentrating, things of that nature, any of your bodily functions. And so we'll list there what's been limited, and that will come from another worksheet that we use to make that determination. And then your initial eligibility date is the date that we have the meeting, and you were approved or recognized as being identified under Section 504. The plan effect date goes from year to year. So, for example, if we start on January the 9th, then it will go to January the 8th, and we need to have a meeting prior to that last day to make sure that that we're reviewing it annually. For reeval, we do every 3 years. We also want to include any mitigating factors, so anything that you may be using to help mitigate any of the concerns they have with a disability. So, for example, if a student is hearing impaired but uses a hearing aid, or if a student has some issues with sight but they wear glasses, or if a student has ADHD but takes medication, we will list that in this section as well. And then the rest of the information is just basic student information. And we also make sure we include the school year because, as we said, it needs to be reviewed annually. We want to make sure that every year we have an updated plan. And so the next one is, once we did the major life activities and we identified what your needs are. And so let's just say, for example, it's learning and the impairment is ADHD. We will put what that need is. So specifically, what is the need with ADHD? The student has a hard time focusing on a task for more than 30 minutes, right? And we have documented that by teacher observations. We have documented if the student took a test, the teacher has timed how long before that student gets antsy and needs to take a break before they finish that test. So we use that kind of information to determine what the need is. Now, for that specific need, we look at what accommodation is appropriate for that student so that they are in the same playing field as their peers, right? We want to make sure the playing field is level for them. And so it may be something as the student does their work in chunks, because we know that after 30 minutes, the student needs a break. And so they may get a break if the assignment is longer than 30 minutes. Or we know that because of data we've collected, that a student can take a test and after 5 problems, they need to step back and take a break, especially if it's a long reading passage. So we will be very specific in the accommodations. Even things like preferential seating, we do ask our case managers to be specific. If you're saying preferential seating, exactly where does the student need to sit as far as that accommodation? And if you look up here, these are just some examples, but all accommodations are tailored to that specific student. There is not a one-size-fit-all accommodation to meet specific needs. And so when I was talking about documentation, this is one of the sections that is very important. When you see this checked off, report cards and things of that nature, and classroom observations, we like for that to be written. What the teachers has observed, sometimes during initial 504, we may ask you to sign off giving maybe our school psych or our behavior support specialist permission to come observe your student to kind of see what their triggers are, see how if we need to make adjustments to the environment. We look at office referrals, we'll look at any type of testing data, we use attendance data, we use all those things to determine what's the what supports your student needs. So you'll see that box checked in and anything written in other. And then last but not least is the signature page. So with 504s, parents are not required to be in the meetings, but in Nash County Public Schools, that's our practice, that parents are invited to the meetings and that we make all, we definitely, make sure that we accommodate parents being able to attend. We prefer to try to do it face-to-face as much as possible, but if we need to do by phone or virtual, we really want the parents in the meeting. We also invite the case manager, all the teachers that support that student, as many as we can get, as well as any other support similar to IEP. So if your child is being seen by a mental health agency or any type of outside agency, we'll ask permission or ask you if you want to bring these people to the table as well to help us create this 504 plan for students. Did I miss anything?
I don't think so. I think the one important thing that oftentimes gets a little gray in meetings is that with the 504 plan or with the IEP, this is what the child needs at this particular time, not what they might need or what, hey, let's put it in here because these teachers might not do it, or this teacher is definitely not going to do it. We have to have data to support all the decisions and what we put in an IEP that child needs right now. Remember we talked about the 504 plan and the IEP plan can be addressed at any time. So while you think something might come up, but we're not seeing it right now within the school environment, then it doesn't mean that when we start to see that, then we come back and address it then. But both plans require us to include and address the needs of the child based on how the child is functioning at this particular time.
And can I add something too? A student can qualify under Section 504 but not need a plan. So let's just say your child is diagnosed with ADHD. That diagnosis does qualify them under Section 504, but if the data doesn't support that student needs a plan, then we don't put a plan at that time. But we can always go back and revisit if anything changes or we notice a pattern of change with that student. Something else I like to bring up, if we feel like this student, and this comes up a lot with behavior, needs to be removed from their regular learning environment, then that's something we may need to consider referring them to the IEP team under IDEA. And so sometimes that'll come up a lot, like, when we talk about removement, then we'll talk about referring that student to the EC team. But again, that comes after we've collected some data about that particular behavior.
Well, and that goes into that line too of, remember the Section 504 is just what accommodations does a child need to help level the playing field. And when you get into looking at possibly removing them from their non-disabled peers or to another an alternative way of educating them, then we're moving more into this child needs a little more than maybe what the Section 504 plan can give a child, and we need to determine eligibility for IDEA, and is there any specially designed instruction that's needed. The other thing is that especially for our high schools, for both plans, we do like the students to be involved and have a say-so and a voice at the table, because we can come up, and y'all know we can come up with these great plans of what we think is right, but if the student says, I am not doing that in this classroom, we want to make sure that we're doing things that they feel comfortable with as well.
And just one more thing I need to add, testing accommodations, we can have those on a 504, and they're just listed on the 504 plan under accommodations. We don't have a separate accommodations sheet that we put those on. We put those on the plan.
Yes.
Except for accommodations for testing, we do have a separate sheet that we submit to the school, and you will have a copy, but we also include that on the plan.
And I'm glad you talked about the 504. They may be eligible but not need a plan. And they may not need a plan with some of our students with diabetes or severe asthma, because they have a healthcare plan or emergency action plan that's already in place addressing their needs. So it doesn't mean that they don't have a disabling condition. It just may be a different plan that's addressed through the nurse and through the healthcare or emergency action plan.
And I think a good example is like if a student has diabetes and asthma,
Yep.
right? Their care plan is taking care of the physical part, but then we start seeing
Yep.
some issues that happen in school. Attendance becomes an issue because they keep having a crisis. Then we may look at a 504 plan so we can address the attendance.
Yep.
Things
So
of
we
that
want to
nature.
address the comprehensive needs of the student, however we need to make that look, or however the plan needs to look to do that. I believe that is it. Do you want to go on to the questions? Are there any questions?
There's only one question, and they would like to have a copy of this example so they can use it as a guide.
The IEP or
The they requested IEP, but I think it'd be
Okay.
good for the 504 if they could just have, I think the yellow stars, or know what pieces to look at is what they
Okay.
wanted.
Yes, and I believe, will the parents get a copy of the presentation? It is linked.
It is linked,
On
and what
there.
I can do is send a letter out again and make sure that our parents, our EC and our 504 parents have a link to it. This is not, this meeting wasn't designed just for EC or 504 parents, but you were the focus for this meeting, so we want to make sure we get the information to you.
Yes, and we can also send it out. I can send it to all of our you can send it to
Yeah, I
our
was gonna put it on the
counselors and
website,
our
yeah.
exceptional children's teachers and providers to get out to their families as well.
We'll do that. So for the person who did request, we will get that out to you. We do want to thank everyone for coming in. This meeting was a response to requests for parents to understand IEPs. Oh. It didn't come on my computer. So. How do I know if my child is receiving accommodations in a classroom setting?
That's a great question. For 504, if you have any concerns, the first thing I do is tell you to reach out to the teacher or the school administrator, and I would request a meeting. And then from that meeting, they should have documentation that they're given those accommodations, especially like if it's a test or any type of modified assignment, they should be able to show you those things that they're getting. If it's preferential seating, they should be able to tell you where the child is sitting at.
I think it's also important to know that you would have a plan in place, right? Like whether it be the Section 504 plan or the IEP. Sometimes we do have parents that question, well, how do I know that my child is receiving the accommodations as outlined on either plan? And that's where you could ask. You are welcome. Anytime a parent can call a conference with the child's teachers, it doesn't have to be one of the meetings that we talked about here today, and ask those questions. How is my child receiving the accommodations? Are they using those accommodations? And there should be documentation that those accommodations are being given. On state testing, we have what we called an ROA, which is verifying that the accommodations are given on state testing, provided, and did they use them? And then that should be in your child's folder after testing is over.
And each teacher is required to sign off. The case manager gives them a copy of the 504, and they do sign a paper acknowledging that they received a copy of the 504.
And
So
for
that's
the IEP.
Yeah.
for IEP as well.
As a parent, can we change the time when our child is receiving services?
Um, it's that's an IEP team decision. You can certainly propose that. You can, request a meeting to discuss their services. But again, like Christy said a few minutes ago, everything we do has to be based on data. And whether it's an increase to services or a decrease to services, we would need something to support why we're doing what we're doing or changing a goal or whatever. But it can be requested and it certainly can be considered.
And I think it's based on too is the child's schedule and when we don't want the children pulled out from core instruction with their non-disabled peers if at all possible. So sometimes it's just relying on if the services were determined by the team to be in a regular education classroom during their ELA time, and then an additional pull-out time where they're then pulled out and worked on a direct reading or math program, which could occur during their intervention time that the schedule has. We wouldn't want to pull them out of their core instructional time with a regular education teacher, and they still need access to that as well. So a lot of that has to do with how the school schedule is and when the courses are outlined on the schedules.
Can we request a smaller workload if a student is struggling to keep up?
Modified assignments,
Modified.
maybe, yeah, that's one of the accommodations or modifications that I did not talk about, and I thought about it right afterwards, but I think what you're referring to, yes, some of our students need their assignments for the classroom modified. In other words, sometimes it can be in the quantity of the assignment, number of math problems they have to complete, things like that. There's several ways you can modify those assignments. Sometimes we modify grades. But yes, to answer your question, that yes, that can be. But again, it's all based on if it's something that child needs. If he needs that in order to progress toward that goal, that would definitely be something the team could consider.
And we would definitely have a conversation about that to dig deeper into why
Yeah.
they need modified
Right.
assignments, because there may be something else that we need to address that we're not. But we definitely could do modified assignments for 504 as well.
How do you determine if a child's going to pass their grades? Is it the IEP goal or is it the regular curriculum goals?
That's a great question. For the most part, it is let me start with students on the extended content standards, right? So if a child is in a separate classroom, not taught on the regular standard course of study, but on the extended content standards, then the team, the IEP team would then look at how the child performed academically on those standards, and then they'll also look at how they progressed on their IEP goals. So kind of both play into that, and then the team, along with the administrator being the LEA representative, make a determination on whether the child passes the grade or is retained for another year. So we have, and we're going to talk about this in another session that we have, are some myths. Just because a child has an IEP or a 504 doesn't mean they're automatically going to progress to the next grade level. So for children with a 504 or on the regular standard course of study, students are still required to complete their work, to pass their grades. If the child's not passing, we ask the teams to go back and look and see, are there any additional modifications or supplementary aids or services that are needed during that particular class to further help that child. And then get in and do work as well with the regular ed teachers in terms of these are just specific things that we can do to help, Tequila be able to access and learn their curriculum. Is there anything else with that?
And sometimes that'll also trigger that we need to do some other interventions through our BATE process, and we'll talk about that deeper when we talk about eligibility. But it could trigger that the student needs to go through some interventions, and then depending on the outcome of those interventions from a 504 standpoint, we may say these accommodations aren't appropriate for the student. They're not, basically working for the student. We've collected data that say this student may need specially designed instruction, and then we refer that to the IEP team to look at the data that's submitted.
So I think we went all around that to
Yeah,
say
we did.
that really the
depends.
grades are very important in how
Yes.
the child performs in the regular ed classroom, as well as how they progress on their IEP goals. And they should go hand in hand.
How can we determine if a staff member is properly trained and equipped to support students with 504s and IEPs?
So the counselors go through annual training, and that they serve as the case managers. When we have meetings and we're creating the accommodation or creating the 504 plan, that's why we have the teachers at the table, because we want their input as well. And so if there's a question they don't understand, how does this look, we talk about it during that meeting. Those are the things that get addressed at the meeting. I can't think of anything that specifically, unless a child needed some type of device. So like, let's just say a child needed for the teacher to wear a hearing a mic or something so they could hear them,
FM system.
then we would train that teacher to make sure they knew how to use the equipment, that it always had the batteries and things like that. Unless it was some type of equipment, most of the time we discuss those things during a 504 meeting to make sure when we leave that, because once they sign that 504 plan, that means everyone understands what the expectation is and what that child is getting.
Right. No, and I think that's right. The case managers, which is typically the counselors at the school, then go back and do a yearly training for their staffs within their particular schools that talks about the 504 plan and what it is and what to look for. We do the same thing. We have periodic training throughout the year. Martha does training specifically for our new teachers, our first, second, and third year teachers with a program that we call NETS, where she meets with them and goes through the IEP and how to implement the IEP. We also have instructional coaches at the district level that go out and help regular ed teachers if they're struggling with how do I implement this child's accommodations and modifications within my regular ed environment, or how do I work with this particular child while I'm doing this direct reading or math program. So that's something new that we started. This is only our second year with the instructional coaches, and having them go to having the ability to have somebody go out and do in-classroom coaching to help the teacher become more comfortable with working with children with IEPs or with disabilities. We've been able to do that hands-on coaching and not just having to walk them through and tell them how to do it. But we do continuous training throughout the year.
And then we also, that's why I said in the plan, we need to make sure they're very specific, because you can write modified assignments, but what exactly does that mean? And so we want to write out modified assignments if the assignment has 20 problems, student is expected to do 75% or whatever that number is. We need to put it in there. And so that also lets the parent know what the modified assignment could look like if they want to do follow-up to ensure their child is getting those accommodations.
Yeah, and there is a section on the IEP that talks about, is there any training or information that the school staff needs in order to help meet the needs of the student and implement that particular IEP. So within your IEP meetings, pay attention to that question as well.
The next question, if I decide on homeschooling for my child, will they still receive services?
In terms, not from a section 504 perspective, but for an EC, for a child with an IEP, we do have what is called our private school proportionate share. So we do have a portion of our funding that we have to utilize in order to serve children who are in private schools. And in North Carolina, home schools are considered private schools. So we yearly meet with the private schools and get feedback from them. What is it that is the service that you need? And then typically, like right now, in our grant is written that we provide speech and language services. So if your child is homeschooled or in a private school, this year, right now, then eligibility would be determined, do they qualify for speech and language services? And if so, a private school service plan is written, and that's how they're provided the services. But that is the only services that they'll have access to. Once that private school proportionate share funding is gone, though, those services stop, and we don't give them again until the following year.
That was the last question. We do want to thank all of our families for joining. We hope that, I know for a fact that this was very beneficial to me. I've learned some new pieces today. And I have been doing this for 29 years, so I do believe that this was definitely beneficial for our families. We thank you for sending us the questions. We will be meeting again, if you refer to the flyer, in 2 weeks. That will focus on advocacy. We know you're your child's number one and first advocate, and so we want to make sure that you have all of the components that you need to be able to advocate so that your child needs are being best met. So that will be our next focus on how do you advocate for your child. Listen to some of the questions. It seems like some of you have some things you want to advocate for your child for, and we want to show you the right way. I can't tell you the wrong way is Facebook, but there is a right way. So we look forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks. Have a great night. Goodbye.
Thank
Thank you.